This is John Feingold with the Race Class Podcast, and the episode you are about to hear is a recent conversation I had with Chandra Taylor-Sawyer. She is a senior attorney and environmental justice initiative leader at the Southern Environmental Law Center. It was really a wonderful conversation for me because it was one of the few opportunities I've had to bring in a lawyer who was working on the ground to think through and strategize how to respond to some of the most pressing issues facing local communities across the South. Almost all of those issues, one way or another, intersect with property law, which also happens to be a class that I am teaching this spring. I really appreciate Chandra taking the time to come on, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, this is John Feingold with the Race Class Podcast. It is Friday, March 27th, at the end of what has been a long week and a long year, even though we're not even in April. But I am delighted because I'm here with a special guest, someone who I do not know that well, but who is doing really, really incredibly critical work in North Carolina, which happens to be where I was born and where I still have some attachments to. And so I'm really excited for the conversation. I'm here with Chandra Taylor-Sawyer, who's a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center and leads its environmental justice initiative. For nearly 2 decades, Chandra has worked to confront the disproportionate burden of pollution borne by communities of color and low wealth neighborhoods across the South. So Chandra, thanks for being here. And let me just open by asking you how you're doing. And I do mean that earnestly. It's a hard moment in a lot of different ways. My sense is the work that you do is hard even in less hard times. And so just really curious to hear how you're doing, all things considered.
Well, thank you for asking, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. Uh, I would say how I'm doing, I'm glad it's Friday. I think in this work, I alternate between bracing for more direct attacks on safeguards that are really meant to be in place to protect all of us, and being okay. So I would say, like that's where I am on a day-to-day basis, being okay and very embracing.
Thank you. Yeah, I would imagine many of us are, navigating, those two feelings at the same time. The next question that I'm going to ask you is one that I ask everyone who comes on this platform with me, in part because one of my academic interests is understanding where and how people learn about race and racism, which comes informally, it's both formal. And so the question that I just invite you to respond to is, where was your racial education? Which is meant to be really open-ended and just an invitation for you to share where it was, when, or how you first began thinking about these things we call race and racism.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful in answering that question for me to go back to my own childhood. I am from Kinston, North Carolina. It's a small town in Eastern North Carolina, around 20,000 people. At all times that I can remember, Kinston has been a majority Black town. And for me, I consider that a protective bubble in many ways, in terms of learning about active forms of racism. So very protective bubble. So my education was really coming through history and civics. But I would say that my most memorable awareness of racism came through observing the fight to end apartheid in South Africa.
Oh, interesting.
That, yeah, that is extraordinarily memorable for me. So I was in high school between 1990 and 1994, which is when we were seeing the end of basically state sanctioned racism across, on the other side of the world for me. And news coverage of the fight to end that during the 90s provided a real great deal of race education for me. And I think I was even more interested in race because of what was happening in South Africa. I was shocked by the inequality and really inspired by the activism to end apartheid. What follows is just my own interest in race education and courses in college. And then, of course, lived experiences, once I left my protective bubble. But yeah.
Thank you. When I was a junior in college, I spent a semester in Cape Town in South Africa, in part because I was drawn there to go to a place in which race was, just etched into society, race and racism in a way that was not all that dissimilar from the US, though distinct in lots of ways. And I remember one of the things that I noticed, I was actually talking to a student about this recently, is that at least my experience then was that there was greater openness and comfort in South Africa and actually talking about racism in a way that was different for me than in the United States. I also had a professor who was like, John, you actually don't need to go across the world to have these conversations about race and racism, which he was right. Yeah, it's really interesting how the anti-apartheid movement for you, is like really informative. So in a second, I want to like really get into the work that you do on the ground in North Carolina, and I guess maybe more broadly throughout the South as well. But I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about your professional trajectory. And I'm thinking of part of, so I teach law students, and I think a good number, they just don't know where people who do the work that they might want to do, how they end up getting there and what the
Mhm.
path looks like. And so I'd love to hear about your journey into your current role as a senior attorney and environmental justice initiative leader at the Southern Environment Law Center, whether there were notable stops on the way, whether there was something specific that motivated it, whether it was just happenstance that you ended there. But I would just love to hear more about your journey.
So I have always been motivated to do work that is about equal opportunity. So yeah, I knew I needed to make money to take care of myself, but the motivation for earning came from a drive to level the playing field for others and for myself. I also have always been interested in science. So
Mm,
like getting me to the career that I am in now as an environmental advocate at a large regional nonprofit organization. So my disposition lent itself to advocacy, just who I was as a person. So I would describe myself as a person who's passionate about what I care about, willing to engage in disagreements, and also disposed to conflict resolution. So I decided I was going to be a lawyer. Like I'm going to law school, and in law school, there were, my interest in equal opportunity. I was looking at being a consumer protection attorney, being an environmental lawyer. I also was interested in international human rights. I was like, which one of these am I going to choose? I actually practiced for 5 years as a consumer protection attorney before coming to the practice of environmental law because I needed to make a choice when it was time to leave law
mm,
school about where I
yeah.
was going to focus. But at the time when I realized that my work to try to level the playing field in consumer protection was really being stymied by federal laws that were preempting good state laws for consumer protection. And I was like, this is not going the way that I know it should go, and there has to be change on the federal level. So I was like, well, where am I going to work next to do work that is motivating to me, to do work that I care about? And I determined, I was like, I think I'm ready to go to environmental law. Like that was part of what part of what my law studies were about. It also is definitely linked to my long-term interest in science. Even though science is not my proclivity, I was not good at it. I just was very interested in it.
Yeah.
So I was okay, but just middling. That wasn't where I wanted to spend my career, just being middling. I was like, I think I can do better than that. So I heard about SELC. Well, I had been hearing about SELC because SELC is always in the news. But in 2006, when I was ready to make a change, I heard about a lawsuit that SELC was involved in the Supreme Court. And this lawsuit was really about preventing the expansion of the use of coal for power. So I was like, this group is going to do work that's going to really improve air quality in the South, a place that I care deeply about, in a place where, the population of people of color in the South is greater than in other parts of the United States. So I was like, this is going to improve the quality of life for a lot of people of color. And I was like, I'm going to be able to learn a lot at this organization. I can already tell, like, it's a larger organization. My practice before coming to SELC, I was with two other attorneys. And I was like, SELC is a larger organization. I think at the time the staff was maybe 40 people. I mean, now we're at 250,
Oh, wow.
since 2006. But I was like, that's a lot of lawyers.
Yeah.
Like, I think at the time it was even then the largest law firm in Chapel Hill. And I was like, this is where I will be able to do work to help achieve environmental justice, because this is a group of people who are committed to environmental protection in a region of the country that is, primed and ready for something better. And that I joined SELC in 2006. It was a lateral career move for me, and have been growing in my experience in environmental justice and environmental protection since then, like transitioning through different program practice areas at SELC. And I saw more opportunities to do regional work because this was important work to me. I was like, I want to have impact, not just in North Carolina. I want to engage with people in other states and have impact across our states. So when SELC intentionally incorporated environmental justice into its strategic plan, I was asked to lead the initiative. And it was the perfect time for me. We had been doing work on behalf of communities of color and communities that don't have a lot of money. But by incorporating environmental justice into our strategic plan, it was an environmental organization that was, saying we need to do more for the communities that are most vulnerable and least resilient. And to be asked to lead that was, I was like, this is just, that's the next step in my career. And I've been doing it at this point for 5 years. So 20 years at SELC, 25 years as an attorney, and 5 years leading the Environmental Justice Initiative.
That's all really interesting, and I feel like offers a lot of useful insight to junior or not quite yet attorneys. Moments ago, talking with one of my first year students who is trying to figure out what to do next. And I think it can be hard to just appreciate that one's career is likely going to take a number of different turns. And so where you start doesn't necessarily mean where you'll end. Sometimes you go to different places because it's new places to grow yourself professionally and to learn new skills that are going to help you have a greater impact. Part of it's also about developing yourself so that you can be as effective as you can in whatever role that you're holding. I was actually going to ask the question of whether, because from looking at the work that you do, I see that it spans advocacy related to water quality, industrial hog operation reform, and litigation involving toxic waste. And to me, I sort of think of that as falling in the environmental justice bucket. But I guess I wanted to ask you whether that is the right frame, and it seems like it is the right frame, but in part because I assume some of my students and other listeners just the term environmental justice might be a little bit unfamiliar. If you could just sort of share how you think about that term and how it might be different than, I don't know, environmental law. Like, is there a difference between an environmental law practice and environmental justice practice?
So, in some ways, I don't think that there's a difference between an environmental law practice and environmental justice practice. However, what I will say is that, and there are lots of definitions, we can go to definitions from executive orders to say this is what environmental justice means when the federal government defined it in 1994. And this is what it means when the federal government changed the definition of environmental justice in 2020. And this is what it means for a state. But I will say very simply, I think environmental protection and health for everyone is environmental justice. So, and the reality is that the most vulnerable, least resilient communities do not receive the equal protections of our laws or regulations that are meant to achieve environmental health. So those communities are often Black communities. They're often communities that don't have a lot of money. So even when wealthy people face environmental threats, money and political power allow those communities to push back harder against proposals that would cite a polluter near them. It allows people, if they have enough money, they can escape climate-driven weather events, for a while. We're not going to be able to run from it forever, even the most wealthy people. Wealthier people can associate with other people with resources who are out of the path of the storm or are on higher ground. Those same communities will even receive more aid from insurance and FEMA than renters will in the wake of a climate-driven extreme weather event. So it's important to do more to ensure that people who don't have a lot of money, that the most vulnerable actually get the equal protection of our laws and have access to a safe and healthy environment. So I would say achieving environmental justice ends up being environmental law plus, because we're actually recognizing that everyone is not getting the equal protection of our laws. So let's do extra to make sure that the most vulnerable and least resilient are actually going to fare better in the face of the environmental threats that we all are encountering.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. There's another part of me, that just in my head is asking, well, maybe to the extent environmental law is not accounting for that context and sort of that sort of unequal distribution of resources and then repair, then maybe that just needs to level up to where it needs to be. I mean, the baseline needs to be a practice that is attending to the way in which you have communities that have benefited from whole histories of inequitable, like benefited from the inequitable distribution of resources. And then, to the extent they're getting paid out more through insurance or FEMA, that's just aggravating that inequity as a baseline. One has to account for it. So I was at an environmental justice conference at North Carolina Central a few years ago, and so I teach property law. A lot of the work that I do is in related to anti-discrimination law and contexts in which laws like Title VI and disparate impact have been really connected to some of the litigation related to environmental justice work. But I realized at that conference that I actually knew very little about the industries that created the pollution and the environmental harms that many communities were facing, in part because I've never lived in those places and because I had just a conception of harms, like environmental harms, really connected to climate change and like global warming, as opposed to living next to a power plant or some petrochemical plant or, in the industrial like hog farming. And so I was hoping that you could just offer some more sort of granularity with respect to the pressing challenge that are facing the communities you work with. Where is the harm coming from? What industry is it? Just to get a more, so I and listeners can have a much more just textured sense of really what it is that people are contending with. And then I'd love to hear after that the strategies for sort of combating it and addressing it. But I continue to think that I lack just a sufficient sort of understanding of, precisely what it is communities are dealing with.
Right. So the list of threats and then the attendant harm unfortunately, is really long. But certainly, air pollution associated with mobile sources, with cars, and stationary sources like power plants are incredible threats for really vulnerable communities. So Black Americans are exposed to 38% more polluted air than white Americans and are 75% more likely to live adjacent to an industrial facility, hazardous site, or other environmental threat. There are higher rates of chronic disease that in some cases are triggered by air pollution or exacerbated by other impacts like extreme heat in many communities of color and low wealth communities. There are more urban heat islands, which also exacerbate existing health conditions. Energy insecurity due to climate related weather events and lack of affordability, like not having enough money to get what you need in terms of energy. So, these are some of the threats, definitely not there's the threats associated with living in a close proximity to a landfill. Landfills are hard to live by because of smells and vermin, but they're also hard to live by because of, outgassing, methane smells that are near them, because of, like there's trash juice. Like a lot of landfills have some lining, but when any water ends up getting into a landfill, there's the possibility that water that is going to become contaminated with whatever is being stored in the landfill. And if there's a community nearby that is on well water, then there is the risk of their water being contaminated by, leachate from one of these landfills that has a leaking liner, or being just near a landfill that has no liner. And still, if the water table is high enough, groundwater becomes at risk. And so North Carolina is a state, a lot of people are on well water in this state. And landfills, they're another one of those facilities that is more likely to be in communities that don't have a lot of money, cited particularly in a place where people don't have a lot of money, or it's a community of color. So, again, that's not the list of the end of the list of threats, but I think it's some that are primary. And like in terms of strategy, I would say that first, people power is the most important factor in any effort to stop polluters, to clean up pollution, or to reduce pollution. So we represent communities who are working to improve and protect their neighborhoods, and advocacy groups who want to ensure environmental protection and improvements in public health. So it is their commitment to the outcomes that they've envisioned for their community and the connections between themselves as advocates to show decision makers what's meaningful that really matters. So once the people who are committed to these better outcomes come together to strategize, then we move to using like every tool that's in the toolbox to get to like these better outcomes. So that might be health studies that help substantiate the need for greater protection of people of color who, like in the Union Hill community, they were people who lived in close proximity to a proposed compressor station for the then what was considered the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So these were a strategy was using health studies, because looking at the data that the decision makers had, the data obscured the existence of this community. And this community, actually, they had more health issues that should have been taken into consideration according to to state regulations. So the health study brought that information to the surface, and it was determinative in a decision from the Fourth Circuit. Like environmental justice is not a box to be checked. This is something that has to be considered, and that compressor station was not allowed to be in that community. There's participation. Another strategy, of course, is participation in regulatory processes, like proving up why there need to be more stringent standards for forever chemicals, like so PFAS. There's pushing decision makers to apply stronger standards, like Memphis Community Against Pollution's fight to get the Shelby County Health Department to better regulate cancer-linked ethylene oxide in Memphis, Tennessee. So they pushed on that. At the end of the day, that the facility, they shut its doors, they left town. there was a lot of advocacy around that, using the strategy of like, we have stronger regulations, please apply them. There are legislative fights, like work to prevent the expansion of mega landfills in the state of North Carolina during the passage of almost 20 years ago, the 2007 Solid Waste Management Act. And of course, a strategy is litigation. That's always the last step in these fights. It's costly, it's time consuming, but certainly it is a strategy that's employed over and over again to stop pollution, to reduce threats, to improve outcomes in the most vulnerable communities.
It's all really interesting. And one of the things that I was just curious about as you were talking is thinking about your role as a lawyer in these contexts, because I think oftentimes in law school, at least, and in maybe just common culture as well, lawyers are often presented at the center of the story and as the problem solver in ways that I think can obscure or erase the ways in which people power or advocacy or really sort of bottoms up community work often is essential in order to lead to change. And so I'm just curious how sort of you as a lawyer or the other lawyers in SELC, how they are situated in all of this work and how you think, yeah, just how you think about strategy when, with, and so it sounds like litigation is for different sorts of reasons deprioritized. But yeah, I guess, and I don't know if I'm asking the question in the most articulate way, but trying to get a sense of how, yeah, how you see legal strategies and lawyers interacting with all the other strategies that SELC and partner organizations are engaged in these different fights.
So I think legal strategy certainly is significant. I mean, all of these other strategies lend themselves, they build themselves to the case if the case has to be brought. Ultimately, what is better is if we don't, is if the regulated community makes a decision that is actually protective of the community, if the regulators actually push for the regulation that's necessary and they actually issue a permit that is not a terrible permit to pollute. I mean, that is the state of things. Permits to pollute are issued, but they don't have to be, they can be more protective. They can say you can't emit this much of this particular contaminant because that's more than what the water or the air can withstand, and the people, right? So in litigation, we are using our expertise in collaboration with our clients who know the realities on the ground where they live. It's our clients and their declarations and their affidavits that are telling the story of what is happening on the ground, because the stories are going to be most persuasive. The law, is important, but people need a compelling story to get to this outcome that is, a legal win. I think, we're very place-based at SELC. So we're working on cases in, directly with people in communities. I think that's different than a model of impact litigation that is separate from, like, who's the perfect client? No, like that's not where we're starting with the litigation. It's like, who has identified what a concern is that is causing their community harm or that will. And then as they are, saying, here's how we want this to look, we're listening and then providing counsel, of course, but it is always I think the community first, the advocacy groups first. We rarely represent ourselves as an organization. So the work that we are doing couldn't be done without, I think 98% of the work that we are doing it directly in collaboration with partners and client groups. So, I think it's just a fact that the people are driving what the outcomes are, and we are providing what our counsel is, what our recommendations are. And the fact is also, too, over time, greater trust between all of the people who are engaging in the fight. That's when everybody's listening most closely. And I think, too, trusting in recommendations made by, maybe it is the community leadership that's just laid out, like, this is the strategy, this is how we're going to proceed. I mean, we are very often like, if they've said that's the strategy, that is the direction that we're going. So even sometimes our recommendations may be different. So I'll stop there, but maybe there's a follow-up that you have.
So it's interesting and it just makes sense. And part of it is that I think that there are very different ways for lawyers to involve themselves in movements or advocacy to try to alter conditions on the ground. And I think you really nicely sort of, whether or not juxtaposed or compared, one where there are people in a community who are identifying a problem, and SELC seems to be sort of a partner in trying to figure that out, but really taking a lead, and an organization that has a particular motivation or commitment that might be great, but is trying to identify an individual plaintiff in order to represent
Mm,
that case in a litigation context. And it is different orientations to the work. I think I think I'm personally more compelled to the SELC model, not to, judge alternative models, but yeah, I think there's also just a deeper, I think lawyering is deeper in that context as well. So, and as you're talking, it really is I think this is all just sort of beneath the surface, but my guess is maybe in all of this, at most, if not all the states where you are working, my guess is that they're hostile political climate in the
mm,
sense that you have, my guess, often state legislators and legislatures, just generally, and often governors whose political commitment is misaligned with the communities that you're working, and are maybe actively trying to get like Elon Musk's new data center into Memphis or whatever is, the sort of, I don't know, the, large corporate chicken factories. And I guess I'm now also just revealing again sort of my lack of, literacy with respect to sort of the precise sort of challenges. But my question is this, like, what is the political nature of the work, or how do politics sort of shape the challenges and the response? And then to what extent is the sort of the current federal government that is actively trying to crush any semblance of civil rights, does that mean your work is exponentially harder now than it was, or was it already hard in ways that this is? Let me ask the question in a more sensible way. How is it different under the Biden administration, the work, than it is now? Like, was the federal government providing like meaningful resources or support to do the work, or
right. So the Biden administration provided significant opportunities in the realm of environmental health and protection for everyone. So, there was a lot of money that was made available through the Environment and Climate Justice Block Grant Program, $3 billion. And really, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, because there was a lot of federal funding that also became available, federal funding and federal resources that were meant to shore up people who have been overlooked. So the Justice 40 initiative was in place with the Biden administration, and was getting to lift off 40% of certain federal investments in like clean water, clean energy were to be directed to communities that had just been overlooked, left out. And there were tools to, determine where are those communities, who are those people, and tools to identify what are the federal resources that should actually get to those communities to make them more resilient, to make the environment, safer, healthier, as well as health. So, and there were, there's the environmental justice executive order. All of those things were, real boons to a problematic area of our, existence, that people who are poor and that Black people and other people of color just end up getting dumped on. Like, so these are things that were very helpful. Um, we still have been in a situation where there aren't many laws that are specifically about reducing these burdens and improving the outcomes in communities that are least resilient. So that's always been difficult. It just was, there was significant progress during the Biden administration. And the work that many advocates, including SELC advocates, that we're doing is about preserving congressionally mandated funding for communities like that. Congress said this money should be spent this way. There's the litigation to preserve it. But in situations that we've seen so many rollbacks of safeguards and additional opportunities, I think all advocates look for the forums where we can make progress. So, there are hostile governors, but there are also governors in states, executive agencies that still create space for achieving environmental justice, for reducing these burdens. So weighing in, like North Carolina still has an environmental justice executive order. There's still a body tasked with, implementing, making sure there's progress on that. So we're engaging with that body. There municipalities, like these are places like where we're looking to make progress. So right now we're seeing all over the South, municipalities are making decisions to pass moratoria on data centers so that they can get more information, like how much water is going to be necessary. Are we going to have enough water left to do, anything else? If we are trying to cool this data center, is there, what is the power that's required? Where is it going to come from? What is it going to mean for the affordability bottom line for energy for people where we are if we allow this to happen? So it's engaging where we think we can make progress, even in the face of, extraordinary rollbacks, because just because the words environmental justice have been banned, that doesn't mean that disproportionate burdens don't continue to exist on Black communities and other poor communities. The problem still exists. So we're going to always still look for the avenues where we can address the problems. We're problem solvers. That is what we do.
Yeah, yeah. That guy in the White House can ban whatever words he wants. That is not, stopping what's going on the ground. I think I mentioned before, I'm currently teaching property law, and I have a couple questions that I'll close with that are even more directly related to that context, in part because to me, all the work that you do is just integrally related to property law. But one of the themes that we often come back to collectively in class is connecting past and present. And just based on what I think is a rather modest insight that you can't actually understand the world you're in unless you understand how you got here. And I noticed an interview that you did with Ebony, I believe, in which you discussed an SELC series that connects slavery area land exploitation to environmental racism today. And I would just love to hear you walk through some of the key findings and highlights. And just yesterday, we're in our unit on easements and then covenant. And so part of the unit on covenants is talking about racial covenants, and racial covenants very similar to redlining and other racially exclusionary land use maps onto heat maps today, where you can see, communities that were racially concentrated in certain areas, communities of color now bear the brunt of the hottest weather, the worst weather, in part because, there's no tree cover or whatever the factor is. And it's just to me, just this really visual example of how the past continues to shape the present. So yeah, I would just love if you could walk us through any of the findings from that particular series that you did.
Yeah. So last fall, we released this multimedia storytelling project, Plantations to Pollution, Black Communities, Legacy Pollution, and the Path Forward. And really, it is setting out the fact that many Black communities in the South were founded like right in the shadow of former plantations. After the Civil War, communities, they were building their neighborhoods, schools, churches under, like you said, like these restrictive laws racist zoning practices, discriminatory social codes, and it just made it easier for people in power to exploit those communities through many practices that still have really harmful impact today, like where highways are located, where landfills get located, where quarries are sited, where other polluting industries are sited. So, you know, in the South, we were just looking at so many communities, like, looking at historic communities, acknowledging the history of plantation slavery, but also at the same time seeing like this is how these communities today are pushing to rectify the harms that are linked to that. So, from protecting a historic cemetery, from road expansion in Bucksport, South Carolina, that's in the shadow of Tip Top Plantation. Reviving Black Wall Street. So I live in Durham, North Carolina, and it's right down the road from me. I'm in Chapel Hill today. That's where our office is. But that community is seeking repair after expansion of a road, Highway 147, that took out 500 homes and businesses. And, that was Black Wall Street in Durham. The plantation nearby was Stagville Plantation. More than 900 people were enslaved there in 1860. And this community now is figuring out, like, what is the next step for undoing harm caused by quote unquote urban renewal? This action of the government to expand roads that over and over again really harmed Black communities across the South. Looking at places like Berkeley, Virginia, and Hampton Roads that has succeeded in getting flood protection after lots of efforts to devalue that community, and the community's been devalued because of systemic historic racism. This was a community that their redlining did exist, and redlining means that people couldn't get federally backed loans. They couldn't improve their communities. That's how communities get blighted. And that same fact was going to be the fact that was going to exclude them from present day protections from floods. They shouldn't be excluded because of historic racism. And that community made that argument and has, made progress in getting protections for themselves. And, this is right near, Point Comfort, Virginia, which is the site of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the United States in 1619. So, there's so many stories like this that show this connection between historic plantation slavery and present day environmental harm on the most vulnerable communities. But then this spirit of this actual action of activism to do something to create, better outcomes for that community today. So in Tennessee, we see over and over again, that there is the American Lung Association has identified Shelby County, Tennessee, as a place that always gets bad grades for ozone pollution, which is awful. So that's smog. But there are so many polluting facilities that are right there. And this is, in Shelby County is the historic home of Inslee Bottoms Plantation. But the people in the present day, so many advocates like Memphis Community against pollution, they are doing the work to stop the Byhalia pipeline. They were successful in that fight. They kicked out a sterilizer facility. They're in current fight that you pointed out against what data center operations will look like in their community. Can it be done in a way that is going to be less harmful to the environment and to the people of Shelby County? Shelby County is predominantly Black still. So these are the examples and these are the stories, I think, that help connect people to action that they can take now, that people can explore this storytelling series, hear the stories, they can decide to act on issues in their own community when they're able to identify how these connections exist and how activism can get to better outcomes. They can appeal to their own decision makers to get better outcomes and support environmental justice organizations. All of that work contributes to getting to a place where the most vulnerable and least resilient get better outcomes. And I think Plantations to Pollution is really a powerful series to show people that way. But certainly it's not the end of the story. There's so many examples.
And I think it is so important to highlight the wins when communities figure, like, are able to come together and leverage power in a way that actually leads to a better material outcome. But there are a couple of things that you were saying that also really resonate. And so when I say something like, well, to understand the present, you have to understand the past, it also matters in regulatory or legal contexts where decisions are made about land use and where something is
Mm,
going to go, and to sort of to justify bulldozing a community because that community is, undervalued relative to some other community comes off differently if there's this story that you tell. Well, it turns out that there were decades of intentional divestment, disinvestment in this community and redlining that prevented the community from being able to get loans from the federal government that the neighboring community got, where those loans in the neighboring community were used to benefit, all the individual homes and properties that then increased all the property value that then created this sort of virtuous feedback loop. But the community that had no access to loans, then it leads to the inability to actually repair and build that has the reverse cycle, where it becomes harder and harder to get financing, and then just creates these positive and negative feedback loops that, unless one accounts for it when they intervene, is going to lead to this scenario where it seems on its face, somehow justifiable to raise to eliminate the community that has been facing the years of both through private action, but then public policy disinvestment that leads to that status quo. And the other is, I do think there's something incredibly empowering when you understand the history and when you see the history, which to me is one of the reasons why you've seen across much of the South and certainly now in the White House efforts to prevent students, to prevent people from learning the history, because I
mm,
think there is something, there is, it's like corny to say or cheesy that knowledge is power, but I think there's a reason why authoritarians in all contexts try to purge knowledge and history, and why something like the 1619 Project was just so threatening. Because if you're telling a different
mm-hmm.
narrative of this country that is rooted in enslavement, and not just, some glossy, sort of romanticized story about the country. So we only have about 5 minutes. So maybe I'll just ask one final question, so that we're not rushed through it. And this is really me, maybe this is a very self-interested question, though I think it's also about my students. I would just love to hear your perspective on what are the aspects of your work or environmental justice work more broadly that should be staples of the first year property curriculum. So, like, what should be in my class that's probably not in my class?
So yeah, like property for me was 28 years ago. Wow. So I'm envisioning, I was like, I bet you have a lot of interesting things in your class right now. But if you're not covering heirs property as a concept in first year property, I do think that it is a significant topic to explore. Heirs property is, the passage of property from one owner to the next without a deed. And this happens in many instances, and there are a lot of people who don't have a lot of money who don't do estate planning. That is how land transfers and how ownership transfers in land. And there are a lot of issues that are created because of that. It makes it more likely for land to end up being developed, perhaps in ways that are not where the community itself is not going to be very informed, because people who have a lot of money can come in and buy up fractional interest for pennies on a dollar. It creates issues for people who need recovery after an extreme weather event caused by the climate crisis. They're going to have a harder time with getting resources when they can't identify that they can't show that they actually own the property. And I think another issue I call like generally like zoning for environmental justice. So we talked about that, but certainly like there's a lot to be applied from lessons on zoning and how those zoning decisions, right, can exacerbate injustice or can provide solutions that are much more helpful for people in the area that's being, where zoning is, the zoning is considered, it's time to consider changing it. So I think those are two arenas.
Great. And we are very fortunate in Boston because Thomas Mitchell, who's one
Oh,
of the leading
yeah.
law professors on heirs property, is now at BC. And we actually recently talked about the risks of partition actions leading to divestment of property where you have folks who've had it for, in their family for, centuries. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then you can get, opportunistic developer comes in, buys up those fractional shares, and then, is able to leverage a legal system in order to, essentially steal property, particular sort of way. Any any final thoughts before we head?
Yeah, I one of my final thoughts is that, we are all worth the fight to get to protection of our laws, equal protection of our environmental laws. We're all worth the fight. So even though it's a difficult time, it still is the right time to take action to protect the environment for everyone. So to do the work of achieving environmental justice. So that's what I'd end with.
Great.
And
Well, let's
and
leave.
thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Chandra Taylor-Sawyer. Such a pleasure and honor to have you on. Thanks for being with us.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too. Take care.
Bye.